If you think you've seen crazy neighbors before, it's because you haven't met Karen from my condominium. And look, I wish I was lucky enough to only have to listen to loud music or put up with complaints about the color of my fence. But no, I ran into a turbo version of Karen. The woman simply invaded my yard on a tractor. Seriously, people. One of those big tractors that uproots trees. And worse, all this in the middle of a Saturday morning, while I hadn't even had my coffee. Just so you understand, my yard is my favorite. I've always been passionate about trees, so when I bought the house, one of the first things I did was plant a bunch. Oaks, maples, and even some cherry trees. It was my piece of peace. But for Karen, peace seems to be synonymous with obstacle. According to her, my trees were blocking her view of the main street and lowering the value of the condominium properties. Of course, right? A beautiful forest is a problem, but her soul, which seems to have soured since childhood, doesn't influence anything. The worst part is that Karen was always one of those who thought she was the neighborhood sheriff. Every HOA meeting she was there, sitting in the middle of the room, interrupting everyone, handing out made-up rules and threatening to fine anyone who dared plant a flower outside the approved color palette. But no one, not even in their worst nightmares, imagined that one day she would have the nerve to take a tractor and go out destroying other people's yards. That morning, I heard a different noise coming from the back of the house. It sounded like a heavy engine. My first thought was that maybe they were doing some work in the back street. But then the ground began to shake, the windows vibrated, and I saw the scene through the kitchen window. Karen, with a ridiculous cap on her head, sitting on a yellow tractor, with that annoying smile of someone who thinks she's doing humanity a favor. She maneuvered the tractor as if she were in an amusement park, and without any ceremony, she aimed straight at one of my cherry trees. People, she hit the trunk like she was knocking over a house of cards. On top of that, she celebrated as if she'd won the lottery, raising her arms and shouting, "One less!" That's when I felt my blood boil. I ran out into the yard, still in my pajamas and slippers, shouting at her to stop. But do you know what she did? She ignored me. She carried on, uprooting yet another tree, this time one of my oaks, which I had planted in honor of my deceased father. It felt horrible. It was as if she was ripping out pieces of my history, my memory, and throwing them on the ground like garbage. And all this with that damn tractor that I don't even know where she got it from. I later found out that she had rented the machine using her husband's name, who, poor thing, didn't even know the whole story. At that moment, I knew I had two options. Either I went after her and ended up in jail, or I did it the right way. So I took a deep breath, went back inside, and called the police. But this time, it wasn't the normal police. It was the environmental police. Because if she thought she could play lumberjack without consequences, she was sorely mistaken. While I waited for the police, I watched from the window with my heart in my hands. Every tree that fell looked like a stab wound. And Karen? Not a shred of remorse. She even took a selfie smiling next to the tractor, as if she was showing off her work on Facebook. Seriously, it sounds like a lie, but this woman is the walking meme of what it means to be insufferable. The wait for the police seemed like an eternity. I paced back and forth, my stomach churning with every engine noise, thinking Karen was going to bring the whole house down if they let her. And she was still there, all excited, as if she had won the divine right to destroy whatever she wanted. When I saw the environmental police car coming around the corner, I confess I almost applauded. Finally, someone to put that circus in order. Two officers got out of the car and walked towards the gate. I didn't even have to explain much. The noise of the tractor, the smell of overturned earth, and the scene of devastation spoke for themselves. I just pointed and said, "Her," on the tractor. One of them frowned, pulled out his radio, and called for backup. That's right, reinforcement. Because it seemed that invading private property with heavy equipment and destroying native vegetation was a serious ecological crime. And thank God I had documented everything I could, taken photos, recorded videos, and made a point of leaving a record. I knew Karen would try to play the victim afterwards. When the officers came to her and told her to turn off the engine, Karen feigned surprise. She gave a fake smile, the kind that barely conceals contempt, and said something like, "Oh, but I'm just doing the community a favor." The taller agent, who looked like a few friends, wasted no time. He said it was an environmental crime, trespassing and depredation. Karen's eyes widened, as if she was suddenly discovering that the world had rules. She tried to argue, of course. She dropped her usual pearls, that the view of the street was everyone's right, that she represented the well-being of the neighborhood, that she was tired of waiting for the authority to take action. She seemed to think that being tired gave her carte blanche to override the law. As she spoke, trying to manipulate the situation as she always did at HOA meetings, the officers didn't even blink. One of them was already filling in a form on his tablet, while the other photographed the scene, the uprooted trees, the destroyed ground. It was so absurd that I began to wonder how anyone could be so sure they were right, even with evidence screaming the opposite. And look, people, she didn't stop. She kept going on and on, mixing up nonsensical arguments, trying to blame me, the condominium, the neighbor's dog. If she had 5 more minutes, she would have blamed global warming. When reinforcements arrived, the situation got really serious. 4 uniformed officers surrounded the area and began to cordon off the yard with yellow tape. One of them warned that Karen was being formally arrested for environmental crimes and trespassing. That's when she lost it. She started shouting that it was unfair, that I was defending people's right to have a beautiful neighborhood, that I was an eco-selfish for wanting to keep those trees there. You could hear all the shouting from the street. Some neighbors were already gathering on the sidewalks, some filming, others whispering. Those who knew Karen didn't seem the least bit surprised. The tractor was towed away. She was handcuffed and put in the car. And even then, with her hands tied behind her back, she still tried to give orders, telling the officers not to dent her bag, saying she was going to sue everyone for abuse of authority. It would have been laughable if it hadn't been so pathetic. When the car drove away with Karen, the whole neighborhood seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. But for me, the nightmare had only just begun. With the area cordoned off and the damage recorded, the officers advised me on how to proceed. I would have to file a civil suit, ask for compensation, open a formal police report, and contact the insurance company. One of them even commented, almost jokingly, that her case would probably end up on the local news because it was so absurd. I don't doubt it. If there was an award for the biggest embarrassment of the year, Karen would easily win. I spent the rest of the afternoon sitting in the middle of my devastated yard, looking at the exposed roots, the fallen trunks, trying to absorb what had happened. Each tree she felled carried a story. One of them I planted the day my son was born. Another was a gift from my mother before she passed away. It wasn't just wood and leaves. It was memory. It was life. Karen didn't just uproot trees. She ripped out pieces of what I had built there, of what was more mine than any fence or document could prove. In the days that followed, news of Karen's arrest spread through the neighborhood faster than fire through dry brush. All you had to do was step out onto the sidewalk, and you could hear whispers, see curtains moving discreetly, people gathered on the corner exchanging information as if it were the gossip of the century. And in a way, it was. No one had ever seen such a bizarre scene in that boring condominium where the biggest drama so far had been a fight over the color of Martha's mail. Meanwhile, I was torn between sorting out the paperwork and trying not to fall apart. Every day there seemed to be a new piece of bureaucracy, a police report, environmental reports, a budget for repairs, a meeting with a lawyer, and of course, not forgetting the technical visits from the insurance companies, who analyzed the yard as if they were uncovering a war crime. Each specialist who arrived let out a sigh when they saw the damage, took photos, measured the compacted soil and assessed the dead trees. One of them even said that some of the species she had uprooted would take years to replant and restore to the region's ecosystem. Incredibly, even in prison, Karen still tried to justify herself. One day, while I was talking to my lawyer at the gate, an envelope arrived. Inside was a handwritten letter, full of arrogance, disguised as regret. She said that she meant no harm, and that she just wanted to promote an improvement in the visual quality of the community. It was such a ridiculous attempt to play the victim that I laughed out loud. At no point did she really apologize. For Karen, she was still the heroine of her own story, misunderstood and wronged. Meanwhile, the HOA board, which had previously treated Karen like an untouchable goddess, started scurrying around like cockroaches. The association knew that if they didn't take action, it would be on them too. It wasn't long before they called an extraordinary meeting, open to all residents, to decide the future of the organization. I went along, of course. I wasn't going to miss this spectacle for anything. The community hall was packed. People who had never even been to Christmas parties now made a point of showing up. Every chair was occupied, every wall leaned against, with residents with their arms folded, waiting to see the circus catch fire. When the president of the HOA, a guy who had never had the courage to stand up to Karen, took to the makeshift stage, he could barely hold the microphone. He began speaking chokingly, trying to justify Karen's behavior as an isolated case that didn't represent the spirit of the community. Only this time, nobody swallowed it. People started interrupting, shouting, demanding changes. They recalled all the other times Karen had abused her position, threatened residents, created absurd rules out of thin air, fined people she didn't like. The list was endless. It was a collective catharsis. Something that had been stuck in everyone's throat was finally coming out. And in the midst of that pandemonium, they approved, almost unanimously, Karen's immediate removal from any position in the association. In addition, they started an internal process to review all the decisions made over the last 2 years, especially those that had her signature on them. It was the end of the era of tyranny. But, for me, the real battle was just beginning. My lawyer had filed a hefty civil suit against Karen, asking for compensation for material, moral, and environmental damages. At the same time, the public prosecutor's office had already filed criminal charges against her for serious environmental crimes, trespass, and destruction of private property. The trees felled included species protected by state law, which made her situation even worse. Deep down, part of me felt sorry, not for Karen herself, but for the personal tragedy she had created, because it was clear that she thought she could control everything, manipulate everyone, dictate the rules of the universe with a snap of her fingers. But reality isn't as flexible as the head of an out-of-control Karen. And now she was going to have to deal with the consequences that no one else could soften for her. I started going to emotional physiotherapy sessions, if there is such a thing. There were days when I looked at the yard and it felt like seeing a relative in hospital, recognizable but devastated. Even though I knew it was possible to replant, to restore, something inside me knew it would never be exactly the same. The scars would remain, some visible, others not so much. Even so, every small victory was a breath of relief. The process moved quickly because the evidence was indisputable. Videos, photos, witnesses. Not even in Karen's most creative nightmares could she have come out of this unscathed. Support came from wherever I least expected it. Neighbors sent me messages of solidarity, left cakes on the doorstep, offered to help rebuild the garden. It seemed that, little by little, what she had tried to destroy was serving to unite the community even more. And deep down, perhaps that was Karen's greatest punishment. To see that, after all the damage, she was the only one alone, isolated, while everyone she tried to harm grew stronger. It was the perfect irony. But there was still the trial, and it was there that her final fate would be sealed. The day of the trial seemed far away when it all began, but it came all too quickly. For weeks, the anticipation grew, not just in me, but in the whole neighborhood. It was as if that hearing was a milestone, not just to decide Karen's fate, but to turn the page on a story that no one else wanted to carry. Deep down, everyone knew that, one way or another, what happened there would change the atmosphere of our community forever. In the courtroom, the atmosphere was heavy. I sat in the front row next to my lawyer, trying to stay calm as I watched Karen walk in, escorted. She was still trying to maintain that posture of superiority, which caused more pity than anger. She was wearing a cheap suit, her hair tied back in any way, her eyes puffy. She looked like someone who, until that moment, hadn't accepted the idea that her actions finally had a price. When the judge arrived, the tension increased. Everyone stood up, and for a few seconds, the silence was so absolute that you could hear the nervous breathing of those in the hall. Then, the proceedings began. My lawyer was direct and objective, presenting photos, videos, documents, and testimonies from neighbors. Each piece of evidence fitted together like a macabre jigsaw puzzle that showed a truth impossible to ignore. Karen didn't act by accident. It wasn't a misunderstanding. She deliberately planned, executed, and caused incalculable damage. Her defense, poor thing, tried everything. They claimed emotional stress, an attempt at community preservation, even a momentary outburst, but nothing stuck. Each excuse seemed more pathetic than the last. The prosecutor, serious and implacable, pointed out that uprooting native trees without authorization represented a serious environmental crime, punishable by a heavy fine and even imprisonment. He pointed out that she had invaded private property, destroyed heritage, threatened the safety of the neighborhood, and worse, showed no remorse at any time. For hours, the court heard details of the devastation. They were shown photos of the uprooted roots, the deep holes where there was once life. Technical reports explained the ecological importance of the trees, the environmental impact that would take decades to reverse. It was impossible not to be moved by the brutality of those images. Even the judge, who seemed immune to emotion, turned a blind eye when he saw the records. When it was Karen's turn to speak, silence reigned once again. She stood up, walked to the lectern, and took a deep breath. And then, instead of apologizing, she did what she does best. She tried to justify it. She said that she had acted for the greater good, that the trees were getting in the way of the neighborhood's real estate development, that she was tired of waiting for the authorities. She repeated, without the slightest shame, that she believed she was right. There were no real tears, no humility, just a pathetic attempt to paint herself as the victim of an ungrateful community. The judge listened patiently. When Karen had finished, there was a moment's pause that seemed to last an eternity. Then he spoke, and each word fell like a hammer into her soul. He said that justice existed precisely to prevent people from putting themselves above the law. He reminded her that no one has the right to invade, destroy, and humiliate others because they think their personal desires are worth more than the rights of others. Finally, he passed sentence. Karen was ordered to pay a huge amount of compensation, covering all the material, environmental, and moral damage caused. She was also sentenced to community service aimed at restoring green areas, and in addition, she had a criminal record. It wasn't jail, but it was enough to mark her record and her pride forever. Her name, once feared in the corridors of the condominium, was now synonymous with shame. When she left the courtroom, there was no more arrogance, just a defeated woman, pushing her own wreckage in silence. And I felt no hatred, just immense relief, mixed with a sadness that's hard to explain, because at the end of the day, I was just another person who had lost her way trying to dominate others. Returning home, I felt a weight lifted off my shoulders. The trees I planted might take years to grow back. Some memories might never be restored. But what Karen tried to uproot with a tractor, I would rebuild with my own hands, with time, with calm, with hope. Because real roots, the ones that matter, can't be pulled out so easily. In the months that followed, the community was transformed. The HOA was reformulated, absurd rules were abolished, new leaders emerged, people who wanted peace, not control. My yard became a symbol of resistance. Whenever someone planted a new tree, they made a point of calling me to join in. It was as if each sapling buried there was a reminder that no matter how many times someone tries to destroy it, it's always possible to start again. Today, when I walk among the new saplings that are starting to sprout, I remember that morning when I saw Karen on the tractor, and I think how different everything could have been if she had chosen the path of coexistence, conversation, and respect. But perhaps people like her need to learn the hard way. And me, I move on, stronger, lighter, and more certain than ever that some storms, no matter how violent, only serve to leave our roots even deeper. Would you have called the police at the start? Or would you have done things differently? I want to know what you would have done if you were me. And if you've made it this far, leave your like below.